Hi, Chris DeLeon here. Now maybe you're coming in fresh, starting with these videos. If you're a student of 6313, or if you're from the outside and you're interested in the kind of skills that we cover for this course, 6313 in the Literature, Media, and Communications Department is part of the Digital Media core requirements for the master's degree at Georgia Tech. We're a course titled Principles of Interactive Design. Professor Dr. Murray presents material from her textbook, Inventing the Medium, focused on design principles. But the skills that we use in this course are writing PHP websites that sort of dynamically generate content. We'll move from there into writing some basic MySQL, database interactions, and using outside APIs to kind of thread together existing functionality from elsewhere on the web. Now, you might be coming in, this might be your first video, if you're just coming into it with interest in those skills. But if you look on the channel, you'll also see there's a couple of other videos I've already prepared, more of which are to come, for LMC 6310, The Computer is an Expressive Medium, a course which is sort of taught in tandem with 6313. The focus of the other class is on writing real-time applications that accept keyboard and mouse input and make graphics move around to do expressive things, to demonstrate some basic sort of drawing algorithms, basically programming for expressive purposes and rapid prototyping. Whereas our focus here is going to be on, like I say, a lot of web content that's maybe less real-time interactive, but still very dynamic and generative. I want to stress that for both of these courses, we're not a software engineering degree. We're not really trying to prepare people to take on a full-time role as a developer/programmer. We're basically much more in the design category, and our focus isn't on things like security or scalability, on algorithm efficiency, but rather it's a focus on how to help designers implement their ideas in a functional way as rapidly as possible, to then communicate with other designers about them, to be able to test them iteratively and develop them as they get feedback on it, to discuss, to make media art, discuss with media artists and sort of, installations in known enclosed spaces. But again, the emphasis here is not really for computer science type students in those kind of scenarios, or people studying software architecture, software engineering. So you'll see some practices which are maybe a little hacky or a little sort of adaptive in terms of, oftentimes in these kind of classes when we're building stuff, we're figuring out what we're building as we're building it to kind of let the medium give us some feedback on what we're developing. But with no further ado, what you're going to need to follow along for this exercise is an FTP client. And so we've got these under the resources section. You can see the website URL there if you'd be interested in following along. And the FTP client, I'm on Mac, so I'll be using CyberDuck. I've got plenty of students who say WinSCP works fine for them in Windows, and other students still who find FileZilla works nicely for Mac, Linux, and for Windows. Any of those will really do. Each one will have different settings you might need to grapple with to make sure your HTML files open up as text files, for example, instead of as HTML, but you'll have to kind of grapple through those individually because I can't really cover the whole spectrum of possible FTP clients. And there's other ones out there. These are just some of the more popular free options available to help get you going. You'll also need space you can sign into and log into, upload files to, and access from the web. For students who are at Georgia Tech in Digital Media's program, they already have space allocated to them per student. That's also part of their hand-in process and directory that basically they can write files into. It's on a server that will manage and run PHP. If you're outside of Georgia Tech, so I, for example, run my personal portfolio site, content, and interactive series and so on through startlogic.com, which I don't mean to push any business their way. But it's worked for me. There's a lot of options out there, but that's kind of a baseline to maybe compare other options to. It really shouldn't cost more than maybe basically a few sodas a month to get quite a bit of web space, quite a bit of bandwidth, and then be able to FTP files up. That'll run PHP, as well as create some databases for yourself to manage and interact with as we move forward in the course. But today we're not going to get to the databases yet. Today we're basically going to be talking about what PHP does and how we can use it and why it's cool. So I'm going to open up CyberDuck, which I've already got open and prepared. And now when you first sign into your server with CyberDuck, your credentials in the server, so on, are all going to vary based on where you're signing into. But typically you're going to see a directory after you first sign in that indicates the space which is visible to the outside web. You might go there by default, but other times you're going to have to first go into your public_HTML directory, or you might have to go into a www directory. But oftentimes there's a possibility basically to upload files to things besides what's web visible. And then within the web visible folder, I've created another folder, PHP demo. We then want a blank text file, which I've created in advance. On PC, you can just right-click, go to New Text Document. You'll have a blank text file. On Mac, I tend to do this by just duplicating another text file with Command D, and then I'll gut it. I just open it up, select all, and delete. There's my blank text file. Let's begin by making that blank text file not blank anymore. I'm just going to write stuff. We just want to have anything at all in there so we can tell if it's going to the corresponding URL we think it is. I'm going to change the name from blank because I think it's kind of a misnomer now. It's no longer blank. Let's say test.txt. I will copy that here into the PHP demo folder. Get a little transfer dialog. We'll see the upload is complete. And next up, I need to open up that URL. Let's see here. And I, of course, happen to know in advance because I was able to check. But you're going to have to figure out what the mapping is between the space that you can upload files to by FTP. You can see here www/phpdemo corresponds on my space as a student within LMC, Literature Media Communications Department at Georgia Tech. cdeleon3 is my user account. PHPdemo corresponds to the folder name, and test.txt is the name of the file we uploaded. Now, depending on which service you're using, depending on your sort of server setup, there's going to be a different mapping between those spaces. For my personal site, for example, it comes maybe straight off of my URL, but you're going to have to figure out the mapping on your own. It's going to be different for everyone's situation, including for students here from one year to the next, depending on where they're doing their test files. But once you have this linkage established and you can figure out where you can change a file, upload it, and refresh and see the changes, then you're in good shape and we can begin to move forward into HTML and PHP. Now, for this particular session, we're going to kind of assume you know a tiny bit of HTML. You don't actually have to know much HTML at all because we're not really using much of it. Though if you do want a refresher on HTML, if you Google, HTML basics, there's a ton of information out there on the web about it. It's, of course, what the web is mostly built on. And so folks who know a lot of HTML are often been very generous about sharing that information out in tutorials and descriptions and references all over the web. Just do a quick Google search for it. It'll also be helpful to learn CSS or cascading style sheets moving forward, but we're not really going to use those today, per se. So we have this .txt file. It says stuff. I'm going to edit it with TextEdit. Now, one of the great things about a decent FTP client, and sometimes you got to, sort of move around the settings a bit to get this working, is you can often open the text file from the server. So there's our file. I can then change the contents of it, save it. I don't know if you saw a little flash of a change down there, but now when I refresh in the browser, the changes are reflected. That's super helpful because then I can make changes, rapidly refresh, make changes, rapidly refresh. And you might think, why don't we just make these changes locally? We'll get there. It has to do with the way the PHP is configured on the server. Now, if we go back to this file, and again, I'm not sure if you know some HTML or not, but these are, I'll actually use the newer form. Strong tags should make this text bold. I saved the change. I'll refresh. But we only see the strong tags. We don't see this as bold text. And the reason is because our extension on the file is .txt. And that's telling the server to not treat this as an HTML file, or to not treat it as a PHP file. It's telling our client to interpret it as a plain text file, which is why we're seeing the actual characters. Whereas, let me close this because we're going to break the connection when we rename the file. I'm going to rename that file to .html. Same contents as what we saw before. Change my URL to .html. And now we see it with the bold tag. Now there's a few possible places that we might experience breakages here that I want to walk through each of them so at least they're addressed and you have some idea of where you might sniff around to fix them. First off, when you upload the file, you may have had test.txt.txt. You may have seen the extension on there twice, and the reason for that is because by default many operating systems hide the extensions for known file types. So for example, if you have a picture of a kitty, it might just say kitty under the picture, under the icon, or next to the icon if you're in list mode, without saying whether it's a .jpg, a .png, a .bmp, a .gif. All these are different formats the image can take, but because the computer recognizes those formats, it hides them as a way to try to present a more kind of friendly-facing experience for users who don't need to know those things. As people programming files on the web, including actually for that matter files locally, we're really going to need to know those file extensions because it's going to make a difference in the code we write, whether it's a PNG or a JPG or for that matter an HTML or PHP file. And there's ways to turn off that automatically hiding known file extensions in your file system. In Windows, for example, you usually go through folder options. There's just a check mark somewhere to hide file extensions. In Mac, frankly, actually in both these operating systems, Windows, Mac, the options will tend to vary. Just Google for how to show file extensions. Make sure you're attaching to that what operating system you're in the version. You'll find instructions out there because lots of people have to get over this hurdle to do these things. But at the very least, when you upload it, you should see here If you have the double extension, that's your clue that you need to show file extensions locally, because you actually, when you put the txt at the end of it, you had a redundant hidden one as well. Now the next thing that can happen is that if you don't have it set up such that you can edit in this text editor, save it, and have it automatically reflected, the workaround for that is to keep the file local, make your changes locally, drag it and drop it to overwrite the file, and then refresh. And then that way you can at least kind of work around the fact that your editor isn't constantly making those updates when you make the edits. It's not as convenient, but it's kind of a big hammer to solve the problem with. It's almost always going to work for you, unless there's caching problems. There's situations where, for example, on my server, as opposed to right now I'm going through Georgia Tech's, but if I did this on my own server, and I tried the situation I just showed you where I can come in here, I can make some changes, save it, refresh, and they show up in the browser. If they don't show up, but you know you've made the changes, because like, okay, I'll close it, in case the connection got lost to the file, I'll reopen it, and okay, well those are my changes, but it's not reflected up here in the browser, it might be a caching issue, in which case, in your browser, killing the cache or going to a developer mode that makes your cache kind of less sticky may be helpful for that. Big hammer to solve that problem is if you rename your file and then access it through a new URL. So, let's say I didn't see my changes reflected, but I go in here and I rename the file to test2.html. Go up here, rename this to test2.html. Then I'll be sure to get the newest file, because then not only can the local client not cache it, but the server as well won't be trying to cache it. There's certain ways servers try to optimize, if they're a high volume server, to cache file references and distribute it. It's complicated, but the gist is there's ways around this, and it's good to know the ways around it for a sanity check in case you're stuck. The other way this might break so far, and sorry there's got so much time we got to put on this, but these are important to some percentage of the users out there because they're going to experience these issues, is if they go to edit the HTML file in certain editors on certain operating systems, by default they might try to open it as an HTML file, either inside TextEdit or inside Chrome or Firefox or whatnot. Now, sometimes there's a setting in for example, in CyberDuck or WinSCP or FileZilla to ensure that it uses a text editor instead of using the system's default for opening that file extension, because what it's trying to do is that if you clicked on an HTML file locally, it would open it up in Firefox or Internet Explorer, and you of course want the text editor, so you got to override that setting, but that's going to differ by what FTP client you're in. The other bit is that TextEdit, for example, on my Mac, which is one of my raw text editors by default, you got to go through the preferences there to make sure that, let's see, open and save, display HTML files as HTML code instead of formatted text. You got to make sure you check that, otherwise it's going to try to show you, for example, here bold text instead, and you're not editing the file at an HTML level, which we're going to need, especially when we start moving to PHP. But if we have all that so far, then we're good to go. So, some more text. Just a reminder, new lines in an HTML file do not get interpreted by the browser as new lines. We have to, for HTML, put in a BR, which stands for break line. When I refresh, and we'll see the change up there. Now, the first thing we're going to do to make this file PHP is I'm just going to rename it from HTML to .php. And again, you can't forget you also have to change it up here in the URL bar, so we're now addressing a file that still exists on the server. And it's identical. Any file that ends in .html, if you're on a server that handles PHP, you can rename to .php and it'll work the same. That's valid PHP. The difference is that PHP allows us a new tag. The tag looks like a little different than anything you're going to see in normal HTML. You'll see it, instead of starting with just a less than, it's less than $PHP. And instead of ending with just a greater than, it's question mark then greater than. And in the middle, we can put a statement. This text is from PHP. Now when I refresh this page, this text is from PHP appears right there. You can see where we did the echo. That's spitting out this text onto the web page. And more interesting, if I go to view page source, you'll see that right here we have this text is from PHP. It doesn't show the echo. It doesn't show the PHP code at all. This turns out to be really helpful for security reasons, that if my PHP code, for example, has my database password and login credentials in it, then you won't be able to see it here on the server, or you won't be able to see it as a user viewing a source on the page, because the way PHP works is that when you access it in your browser, the server runs the PHP code to generate the HTML, and the HTML is all that gets sent across the line. So this is all the end user's computer, or us in our browser, are ever going to see, even though the file on the server has this little bit of PHP code in it. Now, if you're familiar with any kind of programming language at all, you're probably familiar with the for loop. If you're not familiar with programming at all, this will be trickier as PHP moves forward and gets more advanced with some variables, some loops, some arrays, and so on. You may want to then maybe check back on some of the older videos I've already posted, and some of the I'll continue to post more about processing and LMC 6310, computer as expressive medium. That's going to help make sure you're introduced to things like for loops and variables and functions and so on. But assuming you have some idea what those things mean, so I want to demonstrate here that if we say for I equals 0, I is less than 10, oops, missed my I is less than 10, and I plus plus, put in my curly braces like any other decent programming language, save it. Let me actually, I'm going to refresh. Just says again and again, spitting it out 10 times. This text is from PHP. And again, if I go to view source and I refresh, you don't actually see the for loop, you just see the output from it. Now, a couple things about this. The for loop, just as a review for folks, even if you already know it, the first bit is the initialization of the variable. Second bit is what has to be true in order for the loop to happen in the first place and then happen on successive attempts. And the third piece is what to change each time. It's our potential function to move it towards completion. Now, I use I by convention as a sort of a short counter, but this word could be anything. This word could be maple syrup. And as long as, I could even misspell maple syrup apparently, and as long as it's the same variable for each one, then we're going to be in okay shape. Refresh. And the code is going to do the exact same thing if I call it maple syrup. The other thing to point out is that there's a $sign before it. And that's PHP's clue that this is a variable in the code. So, as soon as we start using it, it's immediately declared. So a lot of programming languages, we have to declare the variable by saying int something, float something, string something, where something is a label for the variable. In PHP, we just start using it. This can be kind of convenient, but it can also have its downsides as well. One downside, for example, is that if we make a typo, let's say for one of these I accidentally forget to capitalize the S, well, now we're in trouble, because now we're in an infinite loop. Because the number being incremented each time for the for loop is different than the number that started at 0, and different than the number that we're checking as less than 10. So this number right here is a different variable than that one, and the variable, we're basically going to be stuck in that loop. Server would probably time out and just give us back a blank or a gibberish page, but let's not test our luck there. One of the other challenges of PHP, so HTML, you've probably found if you've ever written websites before, is very forgiving. You can kind of do anything at all, and at least something's going to try to show up in the browser. It's going to do its very best to make sense of whatever the heck you typed. PHP, because it's often dealing with things like database passwords and security stuff, showing things only based on which users logged in, you want to not show that information to people if it's not quite working right. And so the downside is that if we have a typo in our PHP, so there's no $sign here, that's no longer a variable, no longer a valid page. When I refresh the page, we get an error or a blank page or a page malfunction or some other kind of feedback that the page is just broken. There's ways to get errors out of PHP, but they're actually not that great. There's some better tools and environments for developing it, for developing PHP code, and they'll give you better errors. But in general, if you're doing kind of what we're doing here, and you're just writing it sort of in browser, refreshing and checking, if you make a typo somewhere, you're just going to get a blank page. So if I forget this brace, you'll see a for loop here has an open brace but no closed brace, and I refresh, again, error. If I'm missing a quote, save, refresh, error. If I'm missing a semicolon, save, refresh, error. And so for this reason, it's especially important if you're using this kind of, hackery quick adjustment process to write your PHP code instead of a more sophisticated PHP programming environment. It's very, very important to make small changes at a time and to keep checking them on the web page rather than writing a big body of code all at once and then running it and having no idea what is or isn't broken. As long as you write small segments at a time, if you're ever not sure what's breaking your code, you can always kind of reason your way through it by commenting out a whole chunk at a time to kind of narrow down where the problem is. And now comments here work just like they do in C or C++ or ActionScript or Java or whatever. You can do a star/star, we'll go all the way to a // which is telling the code to basically skip these lines, ignore them. Same way we can make a multi-line comment explaining to ourselves what a block of code is about. But now, on the view source for the page, there's just no evidence that that PHP call is there. We got the line skipped because of this line here above it, and we got another line skipped because it's on a new line, but the actual code inside it is never happening. When I take that back, and there we go. There it's happening. Let's say we want to put each of those on a new line. We can put HTML code here right inside of our for loop, right inside of our text string that's being echoed. Anything echoed is going to be spit out as HTML. So let's say we want to start with a break line before we get to the loop. Stuff ASDF. This is text from PHP. Now what if we want to show the maple syrup counter number in there? Text line $ maple syrup. Refresh. Line 0, line 1, and now we kind of expose that loop variable as it counts down, or as it counts up rather, beginning at 0 because maple syrup equals 0, so the first time it was 0. It's doing the maple syrup plus plus, which is incrementing it, and then by the time it gets to 10, it stops doing it because it's no longer less than 10 once it exceeds 9, and then it finishes out the bottom of the page. Now the other thing to know about PHP is that these can exist in multiple parts of the code, not just one. That's all, folks. Hopefully Warner Brothers leaves me alone about that. Oh, put my quotes in the wrong place. Gotta be careful. Refresh. There's our that's all, folks. Coming out of the PHP from the echo. Now you may be wondering, why would we ever want to do this? I mean, okay, it's kind of neat. We can do like a for loop with generating some HTML. Well, where this becomes especially powerful is in the ability to pass variables in. But first, I'm going to point out one thing before we do it, because there's going to be a difference of how we're going to have to do it for the Georgia Tech server as opposed to what you might be able to do on your setup. So first off, if we want to know about what our setup is, I believe that's the call. Let me double check. Yeah, okay. So, if you insert PHP info, left parenthesis, right parenthesis, semicolon, then it's going to stick into the middle of your page. You see we still have the stuff ASDF at the very top. Scroll all the way to the bottom, we're still going to have that's all, folks, at the very bottom of the count from the for loop. But in the middle, it's going to vomit out maybe 20, 30 pages of configuration details about security, about locations, about the version number of the PHP that you're working in. So if you're working in a commercial, like professional development environment, you'd probably have a local server running to test your changes on, or at least a test server if nothing else, so you're not changing live code on the site. You might have a Tomcat or Apache or something of that sort running, and that would allow you to test your PHP files locally. If you don't have a server running locally and you just open a PHP file, your browser will not treat it like PHP. It'll probably treat it like HTML or maybe even a plain text file. In order to get it to really run that code, to calculate the for loops, use the variables, and so on, do the echo calls like you expect, you need to be running it on a server, and in this case, with the exact same configuration that you're writing code for. And that's why sometimes, even though it's handy to just kind of spring up a local server and tinker on some PHP and upload it then to where you're working, if you're kind of working in a new environment and you don't know exactly what all the settings are, again, you can use PHP info to check, but there's a ton of them. It's not just so simple as, you know, oh, is it in mode A, B, or C? There are literally dozens upon dozens of different plugins that can or can't be installed, or settings that can and can't be toggled on and off. Different values can be set for them. And so it's going to affect, for example, how we take variables in, which I'm going to show in a second. So PHP info is going to show us, and just like we can use /* down to / to comment out multiple lines of code, we can also do a / to comment out all the code to the right of a line, or to the right of the //, just like we would, again, in Java or C++ or whatnot, or some other programming language. Now, to pass in a variable, the simplest way we can do it, we're going to show in the next video how to use forms to do this in a more sophisticated and convenient fashion. But one way we can do it is we can say $user equals, let's see here, Becky, okay? And what this does is it tells the PHP that we want to use the user variable with the value of Becky. The way we check for that, we have to be inside the PHP block. This won't work if we just write inside, or inside either PHP block, quite frankly. And we can get to it as a get value, is what we call these. of name user. And we could reference it like this. So we could say echo hello space period space. Great to have you here. Now notice, for example, I'm concatenating multiple strings here. First, let me test my answer before I get too much into it. Yes. Hello, Becky. Great to have you here. Whatever word I put here now shows up there. Notice, for example, that when I concatenate strings in PHP, I use a period. In a lot of programming languages, you use the plus operator. It's very, very common to use plus or to use, even for that matter, a string cat call. In PHP, you use a period to concatenate strings together. Take strings and just, stick them together. Now, get is a built-in functionality in PHP that's an associative array. So depending on what string we pass here, corresponds to what value is passed in. So I can actually have multiple. If I also say, in addition to that question mark, ampersand user, and let's say bdaymonth equals des, I can take that variable name, let me put a break line here, echo, your birthday month is, period, $_get, bdaymonth, save, I'm going to refresh, your birthday month is des. For December. Let's go ahead and, yeah, that'll work for now. You'll see again, so we're passing in multiple variables, the question mark after the PHP, then a variable name equals the variable value. Ampersand, which is going to separate them, variable name equals the value. And we can do it for as many as we want to keep tacking on ampersands. Up to a certain limit we can do for Euro, but you can cram a lot of them in there. Now, if you've seen some PHP before, you might be wondering, why don't we just use $user? That has to do with the settings on Georgia Tech's server. So when I showed that PHP info, it's not just trivial little stuff. For security reasons, an extra line of code that we have to write to use these kind of functions to recreate the way other servers work is we can define for ourselves a local variable based on the associative array value corresponding to the value we expect, and then we are free to use the shortened form of bdaymonth or of user. So in a lot of servers, and this is quite possibly true on your own if you're not one of the Georgia Tech students working in sort of our Silver Skiles server space, you could just use this without using these lines. You could just say $user because we have user there. You could just say $bdaymonth because we have bdaymonth there. For security reasons, one of the things they can do to notch it up just a little bit is to require that you extract it from the array manually, and then create the new variable yourself to make sure it's not being initialized from the outside when you don't expect it to be in a certain way. Now note too, so whereas these periods are necessary, because for the get case we're using an associative array access, if all we have is a simple variable, just the name of the variable, there's no function call here, there's no associative array access, we actually don't have to concatenate it. We can insert it right into there. And if we say $user, it's going to assume that we mean that variable that we've set here for user. Now if I say just user, it'll say the word user because there's no $, letting PHP know that it's a variable that we mean to use there. Again, I put a $, in, and now it shows Becky. And now once again, if there's multiple reasons why this is going to break. Notice that the get has quotes in it. See that? And so that's going to cause us a problem because we now have quotes. It's going to read this as a string. It's going to read that as a string. It's going to be confused about that. And sure enough, we're going to get a broken page. But because of this line here, we have separated it out into its own variable. So we can just do this. We can easily put exclamation points after it without any concern about formatting. There it is. Your birthday month is December. And of course, we can pass in more than just variable names that are strings. We could say count to, let's say, I don't know, 6. Okay. And now instead of bdaymonth, let's change our value here to count to. This is, even though, it's optional, you could just use direct access to your get associative array each time. I find this is a really helpful pattern to write code that would work like it would elsewhere. And this will still work on other servers that do this for you by default. It's just a little more explicit, which doesn't hurt. And now count to, let's get rid of this bdaymonth business because that's not going to be an initialized variable anymore. And now instead of saying less than 10, less than count to. And it seems to not be working for me. Let me see here what could be going on. Echo, count to. Interesting. Aha, okay. I was refreshing with Command R instead of pressing Enter, and so it wasn't passing through my new argument. Again, there's all these little things you're going to get used to in habits. It's been a little time before I was used PHP again recently. If you just hit refresh, even if you changed your URL, at least in Chrome on Mac, it wasn't actually submitting the new URL value, which is how I'm passing the value in. So you see now it's counting up to 6, 0 through 5. If I make that 60 and press Enter, it'll now count up to 59. If I make that 600, it's going to count up to 600. And suddenly we can have our code vary based on what number we pass in there. Let's make that smaller and say like 4. Okay, now it's going to count up only to 4. Also note that we can use that information conditionally. So what I mean by that is we could say if user equals, and by the way, there's different ways to use string compare, there's different ways to use triple equals, double equals. For now, I think this will work. $user equals Chris, because that's me. Then we'll say echo user is authorized BR else. Again, if and else's are pretty common for other programming languages. Else invalid user calling cops via police APIs BR. Save. There we go. So now when user says anything besides Chris, we'll make it Chris, CHRIS, user is authorized. And if I make this Charles, invalid user calling cops via police APIs. If I make this Bonnie, invalid user. If I make it Christopher, invalid user. Only when it exactly equals Chris is user authorized. And of course, this could be a whole block of code in here to show certain things for when I'm logged in as an authorized user. And this other thing could just cut off the code for anybody else. And again, the neat thing about this, or one of the neat things about this to me, when I do view page source, is literally we only see the page content exported from it. So, for example, if I use a different name, and now when I do view page source, nowhere in here does it say Chris. We can straight up have the name we're looking for here. It'd be wiser for us to get it from a database, which is where we're going to go in a later class video. But we could just hard code right here the name it's expecting, and it's invisible to the outside world. It'll only be visible sort of through trial and error. Now, another thing we can do about that, let's say we want invalid users to not see the rest of the PHP page. This is kind of an ungraceful way of dealing with it. But we can say die, semicolon, DIE, left parenthesis, right parenthesis, semicolon. And what that's going to do is if it's anyone besides me, Chris, it just stops loading the PHP there. Hard stop. So again, Chris, it'll show the whole rest of the page. And if I say Terry, press enter, it just stops right there and cuts off the rest, which is a kind of a handy way for if you have someone logged in who shouldn't be, and so on. Now you might also wonder, okay, well, what do we do if they need to log in but they haven't specified it? We have a special variable we can check for that. If is set is the function that it's called, equals false, echo must indicate user in URL die. And so now if we provide a URL with no user on it, must indicate user in URL will show up instead, because is set, meaning is the variable, has it been set? Is it provided to us at all? Has it been set to anything? And it hasn't been, because this value is null, non-existent, because we didn't specify it in the URL. But as soon as we say user equals Jenny, now it continues down, it skips this if statement because it has been set. It says hello Jenny, great to have you here, but then of course it's an invalid user. course, if I say Chris, it'll go back down. And if I don't indicate count to, what happens? Well, it doesn't run the code at all that deals with it, because it's not even 0, it's null. But anyway, so what you might be wondering, okay, but there's not really websites, right, where you just pass variables in by the URL. For the most part, what we're going to show in the next video segment is how to write forms in HTML to submit these get values. So you can just basically type them into fields, use multiple choice selection boxes, drop boxes, or drop down boxes, and so on, to submit these values to another PHP page. And then how we can also change those from get forms into post values, which is slightly more secure with some different sort of affordances. So you could make a unique link node, but we'll get into the details soon. But basically, if you follow along so far, you're in good shape to continue on with the videos. We're going to show some more things PHP can do. Again, next step, using some forms to make entry of this values something we can do without having to type it into the URL. Thanks for coming along and following along so far. Hopefully it's been helpful. If you got questions, please let me know. Happy to help clarify. It's Chris DeLeon, again, speaking for doing sort of a YouTube adaptation of a lab session as we've initially been doing for LMC 6313, Principles of Interactive Design, here at Georgia Tech in the Digital Media program. Thanks again, and talk to you more soon. Bye-bye.